started doing this work, we didn't think of it as an industry. We thought of it as a movement, an advocates movement for patients. And that's something that I try to maintain even as this business sort of grows up and becomes more and more accepted in society. And prior to this, I was a Catholic high school teacher, both in the Midwest and then out in California. And if you had told me 15 years ago that I would be doing today what I am doing, I think I would have laughed at you. I did not have much recreational experience with the plant. I certainly didn't know much about it as a medicine. And I sort of made the transition. It was sort of made for me. I was living in California and teaching, and my father lived back in St. Louis, and he had been diagnosed with lung cancer. And of course, St. Louis, well, Missouri is not a medical state. They're pretty draconian in terms of their punishments for possession and things. They certainly were at that time. And when my family called me and said, hey, you know, come home and just buy a one-way ticket because we don't know when, but it's soon, I had some friends in California who worked in a dispensary, and they suggested that I should take my father some tincture. And some of you know that's just a liquid infusion of the active compounds in the cannabis plant. And I was naive myself, and I didn't know much about it, and I said no. I was afraid to. And I went and sat with my dad for those last 2 weeks of his life, and there wasn't a day that went by that I didn't kick myself for not having the guts to bring this little bottle of tincture with me for him in my carry-on. And I know it would not have cured him. I know that it would not have, probably prolonged his life any. But it might have had a palliative effect. It might have made those last two weeks a little bit better, maybe a little more appetite, maybe a little less apathy. And when I came back to California and was processing my grief over this, there was a whole lot of anger in there too. And I kept coming back to this idea that it was really wrong that just because a patient dies in this box on a map and not this other box on a map, they should not have access to something that could help make their final days easier. And when I was discussing this with some of these dispensary friends, they told me, they said, you know, you seem pretty passionate about this, and by the way, we're hiring if you'd like to give it a shot. And so I thought about it probably the least amount of time that I've thought about any major decision in my life. And I quit my teaching job, and I started working in the dispensary, and they didn't let me anywhere near the medicine itself because I didn't know enough about it. But the upside to that was that I got a really good, from the ground level up view of how these dispensaries run and the kind of changes that we can make in patients' lives. And there were doubts at the beginning, certainly, but the more I saw people really, in front of my eyes, stop tremoring, come in and say, hey, I'm not drinking as much. I can sleep through the night. The more it was reinforced for me that this was right work, and that was a good decision to make. And here we are, almost 15 years later, and just nationally, the advances that are happening with this plant are astounding. So we're gonna talk a little bit about again the history of the plant, how we all got here, and again, if you have questions as we go, don't be shy about just banging it out in the chat room there, or speak up. Ben is listening in, and he can let me know if somebody has a question. So let's dive right on in. We're gonna start by going back in time, and quite a ways back, because humans and this plant have a really long history together. As long as humans have been writing, we have been writing about cannabis. It goes back to the earliest Chinese pharmacopoeia. It appears in cultures and societies around the world, and we'll touch a little bit on those things. Before we do, let's just start with the plant itself, because this is really what it's all about. Cannabis is a dioecious plant, and that means that there are both male and female plants. They have two sexes, and you have to get them together in order to produce baby cannabis plants. Only the female cannabis plant produces the flowers that have the medicine, the medicinal therapeutic compounds that we're interested in. So when we're talking about therapeutic cannabis, we're talking about typically the female flowering parts of the plant. And you see one of those on the right here. That's I believe, a White Widow blend based on what I'm looking at. The family of cannabis has two main branches. So there's Cannabis indica and Cannabis sativa. And you can think of this a little bit like red wine grapes and white wine grapes, all right? So we're going to start with the Cannabis indicas. Those are a little bit more like the red wine grapes. They have when they're processed, they have a little more sedative effect. They tend to be good for insomnia or anxiety. They're more calming. When we talk about the phenotype of the plant, what it looks like and how it grows, indica plants are short and dense and very bushy. If you grow one outdoors, it might get 5 or 6 feet tall, but not much bigger than that. And you see from the picture here, this is a really true indica. It's got short, broad leaves, nice deep green color. And this all makes sense because the indica varieties originated in mountainous regions near the equator. So we're talking about Tibet, we're talking about India. A lot of the strains that originate from these mountainous areas are indicas. These plants grew short because they were conserving heat. They grew dense and bushy rather than tall because they were at an altitude where they didn't need to reach up for what sunshine there was. Here in Maine, indica plants are also good for outdoor growing because, having originated in colder mountainous regions, they tend to be very resistant to molds and mildews. So if you're interested in outdoor growing, you might want to think about an indica variety to get you started here in Maine. They also have a short flowering period, so 60 days, and you can have finished medicine with an indica plant. That's a fairly short amount of time. If you see a strain that has the word Hindu or Kush, those are traditionally indica strains. The Kush strain is named for the Hindu Kush Mountains, which is one of the regions that this variety originated in. And then on the other hand, we have the Cannabis sativa plants, and these are a little more like the white wine grapes of the cannabis world. They produce an effect that is a bit more euphoric, a bit more energizing, uplifting, good for depression, good for physical pain. And you can see from the picture here, again, this is a nice true sativa. Those leaves are long and slender. The plants themselves, if you grow a sativa outdoors, they can get, I've seen them up to 18 to 20 feet tall. So we're moving beyond the world of the cannabis bush and into a cannabis tree. And this is because they originated in equatorial regions. They got a lot of sun. They stretched up and out to kind of allow for more airflow. This makes them a little bit slower or smaller yielders. They don't produce as much as the Cannabis indica types. And they have a lot of space between their flowering nodes, which is part of why they take up so much space and can get so tall. What you see mostly today, honestly, are hybrids. It's very rare to find a very pure indica or a very pure sativa anymore, and that is in large part due to the 80 years of prohibition that we have been living with in this country. People have been doing these amazing genetic experiments in their basements, in their backyards, and they haven't always been good about keeping track of which plant was the mom and how many generations down the family tree we are. And so we have a lot of mixes. So you might have a plant that looks like, this one on the right-hand side, those are sativa-like leaves. They're those long, slender leaves, but that is a very dense, bushy flower, that it's producing. And so you'll get something that might look like an indica, but when you process it, it actually has more of a sativa effect. And that's where a good caregiver or a good dispensary staff member can help you kind of pick and choose. There are literally, if not hundreds, then thousands of individual strains these days. And again, a good provider will be able to guide you based on what you're looking for to the strain that is likely to be most helpful to you. You see there, I also have a note about high CBD strains. CBD stands for cannabidiol. That's one of the dozens of active compounds in the plant. It's important to note that both indica and sativa plants share the same basic, chemical compounds, the same active compounds. They have them in different ratios, and more these days we hear about these plants that have a very high CBD count. That is a compound that is not psychoactive, doesn't cause a euphoric high, and the science is indicating, and we'll talk more about this in a few moments, that the CBD plants are very good for calming spasms and treating seizures. So you might have heard about these pediatric patients who are getting a lot of relief from high CBD oils. And that is a result of a lot of anecdotal experimental work and then also some scientific in-the-lab type research that is going on. So let's move on and start our morning with a nice close-up picture. We've seen the flowering version. When you cut those plants down, you harvest them, you dry and cure them, you end up with a dried product that looks like what's in the upper right-hand corner there. And then when you look closer, you see all of those resin glands all over the surface of these leaves. Those are called trichomes. It seems like there should be an R in there, but it's not. It's trichomes. And that's just a fancy, you can impress somebody by saying, oh, the trichomes are beautiful on this one, instead of resin glands. It's a fancy word for the same thing. And that's where all of the cannabinoids and many of the other active compounds in the plant live. So it's not in the stem, it's not actually in the leaf itself, it's in those resin glands that coat the surface of the flowering bud. We're going to talk a little bit about vaporizing later on, and when we're vaporizing, because those resin glands are really what we're after when we're using this for therapy. When you vaporize, you're not burning the leaf, but you're turning those resin glands into a vapor that you can inhale, and it's a much more effective way to access the medical benefits of the plant. You're not smoking your way through a lot of leaf and stem. You're simply inhaling the vaporized resin glands that have all of the good stuff that you're looking for. So I said we have a long history with the plant. We sure do, and this is a fairly recent find, but she's not unusual. This is a mummy that was discovered, basically preserved in ice in Russia. We think she's about 2,500 years old, and they know what culture she was from. And they know a lot about her. They found her, they were very careful to dig her out, and they ran her through an MRI machine, and they discovered that she had breast cancer, and then she also had fractures on the right side of her body that were consistent with a fall from a horse. And so these archaeologists and anthropologists looked at where they found her and the sort of artifacts that she was buried with, and they determined that she was somebody of high repute in her clan, in her tribe. She was a respected member. She was so well preserved. What you see there on the bottom right is actually a tattoo that was on her skin that we can see, well enough to replicate there. And she was buried again with artifacts that indicated she was somebody well respected. One of those artifacts was an earthenware container of flowering cannabis buds. So it was important enough to her culture that she be sent off to the afterlife with a good supply of cannabis, which was possibly used therapeutically, probably, sacramentally as well. And she's not that uncommon. We have found other similar mummies buried with similar, stashes, if you want to call it that, of cannabis. We see cannabis leaves on ancient Grecian vessels. We have a written record. The earliest written record is, again, in the first Chinese pharmacopoeia, which is a list of all of the medically valuable herbs that they knew of at the time. And that was written, again, in China, about the same time that this mummy fell from her horse and died, so about 2,500, 2,700 years ago. It was called, in that Chinese pharmacopoeia, one of the 50 fundamental herbs. So important that humans really needed it. And they recommended its use for a lot of things that we would recognize today. Its analgesic and pain-killing effects, its anti-inflammatory effects, its anti-spasticity effects. They also recommended it for people with what we would now call asthma, because it is a bronchodilator and a vasodilator. So we go way, way back with this plant. And I would love to take you through, every, 100 years of progress, but let's, in the interest of time, we'll fast forward to the U.S. Now, it's important to know that cannabis did not come to the U.S. once or even twice. It came to us through a variety of mechanisms. So our earliest settlers, before we were a United States, they brought hemp with them. Hemp is the non-psychoactive cousin to therapeutic cannabis. And they used it for textiles like paper and rope and clothing. The African-American slaves that were brought over in the earliest days, they brought cannabis with them as a healing remedy as well. Immigrants from Mexico brought cannabis with them in the early part of the 1900s. And so it enters our country through a number of channels and in a number of different time periods. It started, its earliest life as a medicine started in the mid-1800s. There was a British physician who had been working in India, and he brought some cannabis tincture back to the UK, and it very quickly jumped the pond and came here to the US. And by 1850, it was listed in our own pharmacopoeia. It stayed there from 1850 to 1942. Again, listed for many of these same conditions that we still use it for today. Anti-inflammatory, pain-killing. It was recommended to help with the pain of childbirth and of menstrual cramps. That's also a common use for the plant through time. So 1850, doctors begin to start using typically these tinctures. In that day, you can see on the right there, the typical base or formulation for a tincture was alcohol. Now, at WCM, we choose to use glycerin, and that is because many of our members are in recovery for alcohol, and we didn't see a need to use that, but you can certainly still make an alcohol-based tincture that is very similar to what physicians were using throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s in this country. On the left, that bottle is from 1910. And I know that because it's the 8th edition of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, and that covered the 1900s through, I think, 1911. And so that was produced by the American Druggist Syndicate. A doctor who at that time, you have to remember, would still make house calls, would likely have that in his satchel, just like he would have a tincture of opium, or laudanum, it was called. By 1928, if you look at the bottle on the right, same stuff, alcohol-based. They've gone from calling it cannabis indica to American cannabis, so a little bit of national pride there. But there's one extra word on that bottle that is indicative of how our cultural view of the plant had changed, and that is poison. So by the mid-1920s, again, and this is a cultural view entirely, there was more of a linkage, I guess, between marijuana use, even medicinal, and at that time, Mexican laborers, and then, of course, the jazz scene, and, speakeasies, and these musicians, they would drink and they would smoke cannabis. And so that began to affect the general public's view of even the medicinal use of the plant. And we start seeing it's labeled poison. Also interesting, Parke-Davis and Company is a huge pharmaceutical company that has now been eaten up, I want to say, by GlaxoSmithKline, but they still exist in a slightly different corporate form. But again, up until 1942, it was a fairly accepted therapeutic use for most Americans. So again, without getting too deeply into the politics, it fell out of favor by about 1942. It was pulled from the pharmacopoeia, and we'll talk a little bit about some different federal laws that came into play that still affect how we view the plant. Looking at it scientifically, it's very recent that we have begun to understand the active compounds in the plant. 1964, you see here, Dr. Meshulam, who's still working in Israel, isolated and synthesized THC. And again, that is the only compound that we know of in the plant that causes a psychoactive high. So he does that Western medicine thing where he pulls this one compound out, he rebuilds it in the lab, he draws its chemical structure so that other folks can do that sort of synthesis themselves. Just for comparison, we had done this for morphine and then heroin in the 1800s. So again, very recently have we come to understand the individual compounds of the plant. And then it wasn't until 1988 that two researchers at St. Louis University identified the endocannabinoid system, which explains why these, what we call cannabinoids, these active compounds in the plant, work on humans. So we're going to look a little bit at the endocannabinoid system, because without it, it's hard to understand why the plant does what it does to humans. So basically, the endocannabinoid system exists to create balance in the human body. And it's fascinating. There are these receptors that are built to accept these cannabinoids, whether they are exogenous, whether they come from outside our body when we consume cannabis, or whether they're endogenous, whether our bodies produce them themselves. So in the same way that when you get the runner's high, that's caused by your system flooding with endorphins. Well, endorphins are our body's analog to morphine, right? So morphine, endorphin. So think of it that way. We have discovered that in the same way, our bodies produce endogenous cannabinoids that are very similar to the cannabinoids in the marijuana plant, right? Now, typically, this is a silent system. It's not always active. But when it does turn itself on, when it does see a need to create balance in our bodies, its actions tend to fall into one of these four categories. The endocannabinoid system helps us rest and relax. And so there's a little bit of a stereotype to that, right? The stereotype of the stoner who can't get off the couch. Well, there's some really good physiological evidence and stuff going on in our bodies that really do help us to rest and relax. When we use cannabis over time, our blood pressure drops. Our long muscle fibers relax. All right, and so it is really physiologically helping us. Our respiration gets more regulated. And all of these things help us rest and relax. The endocannabinoid system also has a major role to play in memory, and specifically the development of new memories. Again, another stereotype, the forgetful stoner, right? But there are beneficial implications for this. And the reason I have a soldier here is because some of those implications are really important for folks who are suffering from post-traumatic stress. There's research that's indicating that THC, that psychoactive compound, plays a role in helping us not to imprint traumatic memories. Not only that, the workings of the endocannabinoid system can also help dampen our response to a traumatic input. So we might know a soldier who doesn't like to hear fireworks because it brings them right back to those experiences that they had. We're finding that cannabis can be extremely helpful in moderating and toning down those fight or flight responses to these triggers. Now, there's a lot of concern about, it's going to make you forgetful for the rest of your life. And the good news is they've also done studies on long-term memory. And these studies indicate that with the exception of extremely heavy use over a long period of time, your long-term memory banks are not going to be negatively impacted by cannabis use. So you might forget where you put that book you were reading or what page you were on in that book, but you're not going to forget, the memories of your dad or mom reading to you during your childhood, right? Another function of the endocannabinoid system is to act as a neuro and cellular protectant. Lots of good science going on here. Number one, showing that the system works well, it has an antioxidant property, and oxides erode. I mean, when you look at a rusty piece of metal, that's oxidation happening. A similar process can go on in our bodies. Our cells can get worn down over time. And so the endocannabinoid system functions to protect our cells. Some interesting research showing that THC, it's the single compound, can act as sort of a battery charger for the mitochondria, which is the little battery that kind of makes each cell energized and tells it what to do. So very beneficial there. In terms of neuroprotection, fascinating research coming out around Alzheimer's and dementia. These diseases have some of their roots in the development of plaque tangles in the brain. So this one particular type of protein will build up at the end of these neurons in the brain, and basically they get in the way of the messaging that's going on between neurons, the synaptic firing, and that's causing some of the symptoms of dementia and Alzheimer's. So they've done studies. They have not shown this in humans yet, but certainly in the lab, in a petri dish, they have injected both THC and CBD as sole compounds, and they have seen them slow the development of these tangles and also appear to help break them down and help them pass through the blood-brain barrier and get flushed out of the system. And so these are very, very promising bits of research. And also some similar stuff going on with cancer, and that goes back to the cellular protection. That cancer tumors are very susceptible to being injected with low doses of THC, that they stop the spread of the tumor and that they can also induce cell death in the cancerous cells while protecting the healthy cells around them. And then finally, the fourth main domain of the endocannabinoid system is eating. And I love my little hamster, because if you ever had the munchies, you know that feeling. I can't get that strawberry in my mouth fast enough. But it's very intricately interwoven with our understanding on a physiological level of what it means to be full, what it means to be hungry, and how our bodies interact with different hormones that are produced when we're feeling hunger. And so it's extremely important. Again, there's a stereotype there about the munchies, but underlying that stereotype, the truth is that it is very important to our ability to adequately nourish ourselves. They have done research that shows that breast milk, human breast milk, is extremely high in endocannabinoids. So mothers are naturally producing these and sending these endocannabinoids to their babies from the very first moments that we learn what it is to be hungry and feel comforted and feel sated. So this is a quick overview of the endocannabinoid system. And then this, again, this might be small, it might be difficult for you to read. We are going to post this on our website, so you will be able to come back and revisit this this slide or any of these slides. But basically, where cannabinoids are working is a function of where the endocannabinoid receptors are located in our bodies. And there are two types of receptors. We call them CB1 and CB2. CB1 receptors, basically THC fits into a CB1 receptor, kind of like a key into a lock. So not only do our endogenous cannabinoids open these receptors, but external cannabinoids can as well. And those CB1 receptors are very, very prominent in the brain. They're actually the most abundant neurotransmitter in our brains. So when you think about it, I mean, that's something that we don't hear about much, but they are the most abundant neurotransmitter receptors in our brains. And they are prominent in the cerebral cortex, in the cerebellum. And as you see right there, in each of these areas, the system plays a different role in terms of the effects that exogenous cannabinoids can have. They have a lot to say on this slide about brainstem. You see there on the right in green it says brainstem and all the things that happen there. I find that interesting because the brainstem is actually the place in the brain where we have the fewest cannabinoid receptors, right? And this is important because the brainstem is in charge of our autonomic nervous system. The brainstem is why we don't have to think about breathing or blinking or our heart rates, right? And there are very few endocannabinoid receptors in our brainstems. Now, there are a lot of opioid receptors there. And so the scientists are thinking that this may be one reason why it is impossible to have a fatal overdose on cannabis alone, right? There is no LD50, which is the lethal dose of a drug at which 50% of test animals die. There is no LD50 for marijuana. They estimate that the average person would have to consume about 1,500 pounds in 15 minutes in order to shut down the heart or the breathing. And I think we all have friends who have tried that. It does not work. Fortunately, now you can mix it with other substances and get into trouble that way, but cannabis on its own, because there are so few receptors in the brainstem, is not going to cause a fatality. Okay? There are other endocannabinoid receptors throughout our bodies. They are in our liver. They help us make new red blood cells. They're in the spleen. They play a significant role in our immune system. All right. So, and they are not as dense throughout the rest of our body as they are in the brain. How are we doing on questions? Everybody good? All right.
Bill?
I love this slide. You'll see the source on the left there, Medical Jane. One of the things that can be frustrating when we're looking at research around this plant is that a lot of good research is out there with on websites that for a non-cannabis enthusiast might seem a little too slangy. But this is a good overview of just a handful of the active compounds in the plant. And remember, doesn't matter what strain you're talking about, all cannabis plants share these compounds in different ratios. And this slide shows what the science is telling us that each of them can do, right? And remember, it's just those ones in that top right-hand quadrant that are going to cause the psychoactive high. But we have anti-inflammatory, we have CBC on the top left, promoting bone growth, important for women approaching menopause. There's just a number of very, very good, solid scientific studies showing all of these effects. And you see that CBD gets a lot of airtime here, or page space, because it is really doing some amazing stuff in the lab and certainly anecdotally in patients. Another thing that we need to realize about CBD, which is cannabidiol, is that one of its functions is to regulate the psychoactive effect of THC, right? So CBD is actually making sure that you don't get too euphoric from the THC in the plant. Pardon me, take a drink here. And this gets to something that's really significant if you care about this plant and the kinds of laws that we're making about it, all right? So from a Western medical tradition, we're going to do what Dr. Meshulam started back in 1964, right? We're going to take that THC, that delta-9 THC, and we're going to pull it out and isolate it and synthesize it and turn it into a pill. And we've already done that with delta-9 THC, and we call that pill Maricinal or dronabinol. And it's a Schedule III drug. It can be prescribed. You can take it on a plane with you. They use it for cancer patients who are having trouble keeping food down. Unfortunately, what they're finding is that Maricinal alone, when they ask patients who have had the opportunity to try both whole plant cannabis and the pill form of Maricinal, which is better, patients overwhelmingly prefer the whole plant medicine. And that's one, I guess it shouldn't be surprising, because we know that CBD moderates the effects of THC. We know that there's so much we don't know about all of these compounds. And again, this is a handful. There are dozens more that we're still discovering. And so while Western medicine's intention or tendency is to pull them apart and create different medicines. Let's have a CBC pill. Let's have a CBD pill. Oh, that's not good for pain relief. Well, let's make a THC pill for that. And what we miss out on when we do that is the synergistic effects of all of these compounds working together, right? And we don't have a good mechanism in place in terms of research in this country to look at all of them together. We're very good at pulling them apart and looking at them individually and analyzing them, but we don't have a really good approach to a whole plant integrative type of medicine here. In fact, we don't define medicine as anything like a whole plant, right? Medicine is what the doctor prescribes and we pick up at the pharmacy, and it's a standardized dose, and the doctor controls dosing, and that's not like cannabis. So there's a tension between people who choose this whole plant medicine and the traditional Western medical paradigm. And we see that reflected when doctors say, I won't certify you to use this stuff. I'll give you a Maricinal prescription, but I'm not going to certify you to use a tincture, because they're saying we don't understand enough about the plant yet. And we'll look at what that really means and looks like in a moment. So, federal and state regulations, my mind. We can do a whole 2 hours on this. We'll make it quick. So let's go back in time again. We're in 1937 now. So we saw in the 20s the cultural attitude towards the plant started to shift. Prohibition in the early 30s, prohibition ends. So we had a huge legal and law enforcement system set up to enforce an unenforceable alcohol prohibition. And when that ended in 1932-33, a lot of folks were looking at me out of work. And so very quickly, we see, 4 years later, the first federal law that results in the criminalization of some sales and production of marijuana. The Tax Act that we passed federally in 1937 made it illegal for anyone to sell any form of cannabis without paying the government, without paying taxes, without registering as, you see there, a producer of marijuana, right? Some people got their stamps. We see Lester Kurtzstein up in, what was it, Orkeesian, Wisconsin. He got his stamp. He paid the government. The gentleman on the right there is Samuel Caldwell, and October 2nd of 37 was the first day the Marijuana Tax Act went into effect. Mr. Caldwell is the first person in the U.S. to have been federally arrested for the crime of selling 2 joints, right? And you see there he was sentenced to 4 years at hard labor and a $1,000 fine. Again, this was for 2 cannabis cigarettes. The person he sold them to was an immigrant, a Mexican laborer, and that man served 18 months in Leavenworth and had, I think, a $500 fine. But this is the first time in our country that we criminalize some form of commerce related to this plant. And I didn't know Mr. Caldwell or his family, but he looks like he was a farmer to me. And so this was a big change. Also, if you appreciate irony, this all happened in Denver, Colorado. So we've come a long way unfortunately not fast enough for the Samuel Caldwells of the world, however. Another interesting note, both the American Physicians Association, the American Medical Association, and the Pharmacists Association opposed this tax act because they were, in general, the leading legal purveyors up until that time of these products. It becomes harder and harder to use cannabis medicinally and openly, and by 1942, again, it comes off of the pharmacopoeia. It can no longer be recommended or used therapeutically. Also interesting to note that in 1942, the U.S. Department of Agriculture was actively encouraging American farmers to produce hemp for the war effort, again, to make rope and clothing and everything. So on the one hand, the therapeutic side of the plant was being pushed underground, and on the other hand, we've got the hemp side being promoted by the same federal government. So we roll along in sort of this, the Marijuana Tax Act has effectively driven most cannabis underground. By the 60s, however, we have soldiers who have spent time in Vietnam, which is an equatorial country where cannabis originated and is abundant, grows very well there. A lot of these soldiers encountered marijuana in Vietnam and they brought it home. A lot of the anti-war protesters discovered it, and it kind of fit in with the peaceful nature of their messaging. And by 1970, again, the federal government has to, in its mind, has to take a stand. We have to do something about this. It's just too widely available. And so in 1970, we get another landmark federal decision, and we call it the Controlled Substances Act. And for the last 45 years, this has shaped how we view cannabis and the people who use it. What the CSA did was to create 5 schedules for drugs. And important to note that the Controlled Substances Act is administered by the Department of Justice, not by the American Medical Association, not by pharmacists, not by farmers, but by the Department of Justice. So we are fully in the realm of criminal activity here. And they said, okay, we're going to set up 5 schedules, and we're going to sort drugs into each of these schedules. And Schedule 1 is going to be all of the drugs that have no medicinal use, a high potential for abuse, and a lack of accepted safety even under a doctor's supervision. So there's these 3 standards for a drug to be Schedule 1. No medical use, high potential for abuse, and a lack of safety even under a doctor's supervision. You can't prescribe a Schedule 1 drug, right? Your doctor can't write you a prescription for psilocybin, which is mushrooms. They can't write you a prescription for straight heroin. So this is Schedule 1. Schedule 2, each of the other schedules is like a step down in I guess, perceived impact. Schedule 2 has some medical use, but still a high potential for abuse. Schedule 3, we're getting a little less stringent. And then 4 and 5, you can see what kind of drugs end up in those schedules. You can prescribe any Schedule 2, 3, 4, or 5 drug. All right. And it's interesting to notice that Schedule 2, oxycodone, that is a heroin derivative, right? But it is a single compound pulled out of the opium plant and turned into a synthetic pill form. So pay attention to that. And notice how many whole plants are in Schedule 1, right? Marijuana, peyote, which is a psychedelic cactus, psilocybin, right? These are natural whole plants that ended up being the most remote and the most dangerous possible. Remember again that Schedule 3, Marinol, fits in Schedule 3. And so a doctor can prescribe that. So the Controlled Substances Act, again, has limited, has guided how we think about these drugs and the people who use them. You will notice that alcohol and tobacco, nicotine, do not appear on the Controlled Substances Act. All right? Just something to be aware of there. Many of us hear this. You might have heard it. Some of your friends or your physicians may have said it. There's just no scientific support, right? Well, in part that goes back to the whole, we don't see a whole plant as medicine. But actually, there is some really interesting scientific support. And I'm going to leave this up here. PubMed is a national clearinghouse operated by the U.S. National Institutes of Health. You can get to their website by typing in www.pubmed.gov or .com. We'll take you there. And it is a clearinghouse of all scientific research that's going on here and in other countries. All right? So when they say there is no scientific support, if you go on PubMed, and I did just this morning, and I typed in their search engine the word cannabis, and it returned 13,000 responses, right? Actually, that's gone up. This says 764. This morning it was 13,951, I want to say. All right? So there's 21,000 studies if you just search for marijuana. Dronabinol, which is the generic term for Marinol. Tons of studies, right? 650 studies on marijuana and cancer alone. By comparison, just a few commonly used drugs, hydrocodone, only 735. Ritalin, 7,000. Lisinopril, which is a common heart medication, 2,500. So the scientific research is out there. A lot of it's happening in other countries. A lot of it doesn't make headlines here in the U.S., but it's happening. It's happening in Israel, Uruguay, the Netherlands, Spain, all sorts of places. So when they say there's no scientific support, point folks at PubMed. It is important to note that because PubMed is operated by our government, and certainly when you do research into cannabis in the U.S., that is controlled by the National Institutes on Drug Abuse. And those folks, NIDA, are not likely to give out research money or grants to scientists who come in and say, I want to show that marijuana is positive, that it has these great therapeutic values. So a lot of the research takes an anti-marijuana stance from the get-go. And when you go on that website and start searching around, you'll see it even in the titles. They're looking at marijuana use by adolescents. Well, we don't promote marijuana use for adolescents unless they're very ill. They're looking at, they're looking for a link between marijuana and mental disorders. Well, we don't think that, folks who suffer from some of these severe mental disorders should probably use this as a first resort. But to go at it from a standpoint of looking for trouble, you tend to find what you're looking for, right? So keep that in mind. But there are many, many positive studies on this site as well. So today, we have a mishmash of organizations at the federal and state level that are kind of swirling around this planet. Everybody's kind of got their own view of it. So the Department of Justice, again, they look at the criminal side, and they're looking for violations of that Controlled Substances Act and people who are trafficking in marijuana. NIDA, I just talked about. These are the folks who are issuing grants to study the substance, and that's, again, because the federal government controls them. That controls the sort of research that they fund. The Food and Drug Administration gets their hands in there when we're talking about things like high CBD oils, or any sort of a preparation that is being sold and promoted as having a medical benefit. The FDA is there to send out warnings to companies to say, hey, you can't say that marijuana is going to cure cancer or even treat cancer, because in their mind, the science isn't there. And then on the state side, our marijuana program it lives under the Department of Health and Human Services. There's a division called Licensing and Regulatory Services, and those folks have the regulatory oversight of Maine's medical marijuana program. And we'll get into what that means in just a moment. One more federal note. Federal policy has not really changed on marijuana, even in states where it is legal to use either medicinally or for social purposes. There has been no change of policy. What there has been is a series of memos that have come out from the Department of Justice and giving guidance to states' attorneys general. The most recent one came out in August of 2013, so about 8 months after Colorado legalizes marijuana. The Department of Justice looks around and says, we have 23 states and the District of Columbia that allow medical use. We have 2 states at that time that allow adult use. We better make a statement of some sort. We either continue this drug war or we need to find a way to sort of peacefully back out of it. And so they issue this memo, and the memo basically says we don't think it is going to be a good expenditure of federal funds to persecute and prosecute medical or other marijuana cases in states where there are clear regulations and the state is doing a good job of oversight and enforcement. And they said, especially, we don't want to see a few very specific things. And those things are listed here. They don't want to see gun violence related to, the distribution of medical or adult use cannabis. They don't want to see diversion to states that don't have laws and regulations. They don't want to see distribution to minors. None of us do. They don't want to see growing or possessing on federal lands. And we do have federal park here in Maine, so that's important to note. If you have a joint, in your person, and you're caught on federal lands by a federal agent, your state medical marijuana certificate is not going to do you any good. It means nothing to them. So you need to be careful about that. And so they don't want to see these things. Now, that doesn't mean that the raids have stopped. As recently as a couple of weeks ago, there was a dispensary in South Tahoe, California that was shut down. But it does seem that in states like Maine, where there's a pretty rigorous program in place and a pretty good level of state oversight, the feds are not as interested as they were even 5 or 6 years ago in terms of raids, closing people down. And in general, it has been a long time since the feds have gone after patients who are using medicinal cannabis within the boundaries of state laws. The optics on that are really bad, right? These are sick people, and for them to be seen coming in and taking therapeutic cannabis away, I think they're smart enough to realize that does not look good. So this map kind of gives us an overview of where we are in the U.S. And actually, I almost feel like it needs to be updated already. This is like 6 weeks, 8 weeks old. So things are moving quickly. But basically, you see the purple states. Those have legal adult use. They also happen to all be medical use states as well. Arizona, Alaska, Washington, Oregon. There are some states that have medical programs. And you see our neighbor, New Hampshire. Let's look at New Hampshire, because New Hampshire has a medical program, but they do not have dispensaries up and running yet. And in the absence of dispensaries, the state has not been issuing certifications to patients. And so in New Hampshire, they have medical, but they don't really have medical. And that's true of a couple of these different states. There might be a law in place, but the implementation has not been good. Hawaii, for example, has had medical for over a decade, I believe, and they are just this year starting to open dispensaries and a real access point for patients there. The light green states have decriminalized possession of some amount. Typically not, if you have 2 pounds, that's probably more than any of these states allow. And what decriminalization means, it's not the same as legalization. It's not granting the right to use or sell or any sort of distribution system, certainly not to grow, right? That's still a no-no. In a decriminalized state, if you get caught in possession of a certain amount of cannabis, and it could be an ounce, it could be 2 ounces, it's typically not a great deal. Instead of it being a criminal violation that goes on a criminal record, it's a civil infraction, more like a traffic ticket, right? So when we talk about decriminalized states, we're not talking about legal states at all. Many states have both medical and decrim. So here in Maine, we have a robust medical system, and then we also have a decriminalized system where if you're caught with some, it's not going to be anything other than a civil infraction. And then finally, we have a lot of the country where it is still fully illegal at the state level, at the federal level. It's just not. It's, you know, you're going to do jail time for any amount, even the residue in a pipe, right? Interesting to note that all of the states that have medical marijuana, so there's 23 of us now, plus the District of Columbia, all of those states, all those places have a citizens initiative process. The states that do not have a citizens initiative process, well, you see them there. They're the fully illegal states, and they all have to wait for their legislatures to make the laws for them. Unlike here in Maine, where in 1999 and 2009, we took it to the voters. Right? Pardon me. Are there any questions before we get in depth on Maine's regs? All right. So here in Maine, in 1999, we passed a medical marijuana law. And then in 2009, we passed a law that allowed for distribution centers, for dispensaries, and there are 8 around the state. The qualifying conditions in Maine have evolved over time, all right? And we keep trying to add them, because as you see here, I mean, that's a pretty complete list, and if you have any of these conditions, yeah, you should have access to this therapeutic option. But Parkinson's is not on this list. Depression as a standalone condition is not on this list. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not on this list until 2013 when we added it via the legislature. So it's not as complete as it could be. And we hear all the time from patients who have, you know, Crohn's disease or a serious digestive problem, and they'll come back to us and say, you know, this helps immensely with my stomach, but it also helped me with my depression, because it can be a real downer to be very seriously ill. And we know that there are plenty of folks who have serious depression but don't happen to have a qualifying condition, and we believe that they should have access. There was a bill in front of our legislature just this session that was shot down yesterday that would have allowed the physician to decide that, you know, what conditions qualified a patient. So it would have opened the door up to a number of these folks. Again, the legislature turned it down. So we've got work to do. On the left there, you see Sean Azariti. Now, Sean is a Colorado resident. He was actually the first person to buy legal adult-use cannabis in Colorado in 2013 when sales started. And why would I have a picture of Sean up here? Well, in Colorado, they had a medical program like Maine. They had a list of conditions like Maine. And their list of conditions did not include post-traumatic stress disorder. And Sean is an Army veteran. And he was self-treating illegally his PTS with cannabis. But it wasn't until they opened it up to adult use for all, 21 and up, that he was able to legally access this medicine that had been helping him for years since he got out of the service. On the right, you see Elvie Musica. Elvie is a glaucoma patient. She lives in Oregon, and she's got a fascinating story. You might not realize that our federal government, from the years of 1978 to 1992, operated a compassionate investigational new drug program. And what that meant was our federal government began growing cannabis at the University of Mississippi. They still do. And they enrolled a total of 14 people in this investigational program. And Elvie was one of them. Some others had different, HIV/AIDS, glaucoma, Neil Patelis syndrome, which is a very rare but painful and disfiguring disease. So Elvie is one of these initial 14 patients, and the federal government, to this day, sends Elvie a tin of 300 pre-rolled cigarettes of cannabis from the research facility down at the University of Mississippi, and that's what she's holding there. She gets one of those a month from our federal government. There are 2 surviving patients from that program, again, that ended in 1992, and she is one of them. So, again, you have to get used to irony and a lot of cognitive dissonance, but our federal government sends LV cannabis every month. At the same time, it says that it's a Schedule I drug that is very dangerous. So, kind of an interesting side note there, I guess. There are also some symptoms that are covered. Cachexia is the inability to keep food down, nausea, seizures, muscle spasms. And this picture here is of a nursing home patient in Israel, and she's showing the cannabis oil capsules. Israel has an equally fraught relationship with cannabis as we do. It is still illegal for adults to purchase or use it. They do have a limited medical program, but they're way ahead of us in terms of nursing home and hospice care. And there are several facilities that allow patients to use various forms of cannabis, smoked, edible, or otherwise, in their facilities. So Bahia is one of them, and just sort of an indication of where we could be if we could open things up a little bit. Sourcing options. All right, so patients in Maine, once you get that doctor's certification, and it's very important to know this, if you're planning to have a conversation with a physician or a nurse practitioner, think about this, all right? Well, first of all, in Maine, an MD, a DO, or a nurse practitioner may certify a patient. So MD, DO, NP. Those are the folks that can do it. And it is a certification. So when you're talking to a physician, when you say, I need a prescription for medical cannabis, you can't, that turns doctors' ears off, right? Because they know that this is a Schedule I drug and they are forbidden from prescribing it. They can lose their license, their DEA license that allows them to prescribe if they prescribe any of those Schedule I drugs. So you're not asking for a prescription. And another kind of casual term that people use sometimes is a recommendation. You know, hey doc, I need a recommendation for medical cannabis. Well, what that implies to a doctor is that they are approving, they are suggesting that you are going to use this. They're recommending this. And that as well can get them in trouble with their licensing boards. Okay? All a doctor is doing is certifying that you have one of the qualifying conditions, okay? And that should be in the context of a bona fide doctor-patient relationship. They need to look at your medical records. They need to evaluate the totality of your health and your other medicines that you might be taking, and then they can certify you. And it simply says, I certify that Ben has ALS, and that if he decides to try medical cannabis, I will continue to monitor his health. In the same way that if he decides to try, high doses of echinacea, I will continue to monitor his health. So when you're talking to your physicians, it's important to use the right language. And once you have that certification, there's options. You can grow your own. You can designate an individual caregiver to provide medicine for you, or you can designate a dispensary to provide medicine. Pardon me. Then you're going to edit out all the coughing, right? Okay. On the left there, you see a home grow setup. These are little grow boxes that you can get at many of the garden stores these days. And that setup is well within Maine's regulations. On the left-hand side, they have their little vegetative seedlings. In the middle, those are teenage plants. They're not flowering yet. And then on the right-hand side, they've got a single plant that they're doing in a lollipop formation. So that's well within state regulations. On the right-hand side, that's a look inside the vegetative room at Wellness Connection at our grow facility. And if you look, hold on just a second. If you look back here, you see these that look like bushes in the back. Those are mother plants. So we grow some of our product from seed, and once we find a good, strong genetic breed or strain, we will grow up a very healthy plant that we never put into flowering. And she becomes a mother plant. And we take cuttings from her, and each of those cuttings will be an exact genetic copy, a clone of that mother plant, and have the same, ideally, will have the same strength, the same vigor, and produce quality medicine as well. All right. What did I do? Oops. Then I think I might need your... Oh, I got it. Normal non-drawing mode. Let's try that. Oh, how do I get that? Well, Ben helps us out. I'm going to keep chatting. So in terms of, okay, so you've got your certification and you know what your options are. If you choose a caregiver, if you choose to grow your own, if you choose a dispensary, there are two ways to look at this. There's the regulated and then the unregulated options. So in Maine, if you're growing at home or if you're designating a caregiver to grow for you, those options are unregulated. So that means that there's not going to be somebody coming in and doing an inspection of your facility or counting your plants or making sure what kind of nutrients you're using or that you're not using pesticides. So if you're thinking of growing at home, if you read the regs and you do it discreetly and within the boundaries of the law, it's quite safe here in Maine. The Department of Licensing and Regulatory Services has just created a team of 3 former sheriff's deputies who respond to complaints only. All right? And so it's unfortunate, but in the absence of real regulatory oversight, the regulation ends up falling to this sort of, well, it's not law enforcement because they're all retired, but it's a complaint-based system. And some of the complaints, I mean, if you're growing in a manner that is offensive to your neighbors, if they can see or smell your plants, they might have a problem with that, right? Or if you're growing 400 plants instead of 6 plants, and somebody notices that might trigger an inspection, right? And so it's important to be aware of how necessary it is, because there are still plenty of folks who don't think that this is medicine at all, that it's a big front and a farce, and every time one of those stories makes the papers, it reflects poorly on all of us, really, right? A caregiver can serve up to 5 patients, and so a caregiver can also themselves be a patient, so that gives them a total of 36 flowering plants that they can grow. Collectives and co-ops are not allowed in Maine. Again, there's no regulatory oversight, but if a complaint is made, they will investigate. And there are literally hundreds of small businesses out there, caregivers who are growing for 1 to 5 patients. And that means that there's a lot of variety. There's different prices, there's different quality, product safety in terms of what substances they might be using on the plants, reliability in terms of can I come over at noon or can you bring it by on a regular basis. And then we know that home growing is just not feasible for many folks, whether you're in an apartment or you're too sick to do it, that's just not an option. At the bottom there, you see 2 indoor setups, both of which are well within Maine's regulations in terms of the number of plants that you can use. So, on the regulated side, it approves 8 state-licensed and inspected dispensaries. We are in Biddeford, Auburn, Portland, Gardner, Thomaston, Brewer, Ellsworth, and up in Eagle Lake, right? So the state does come out, DLRS does come out and inspect us. They have to, they look at our employment records, they look at our inventory controls to make sure that we can account for every bit of medicine and that there's no diversion. Our facilities are required to be secure. Typically, all of us will offer a variety of strains, different delivery devices, so you can pick up a vaporizer or a pipe on site if you want to. Different classes and events. There are no purchase limits or incentives. Now, the problems with the regulated side, obviously with those 8 dispensaries being it, they're not accessible to everybody. And because of the regulatory burdens, rent, overhead, employees, prices may be slightly higher. In general, I believe that we're all still in the same ballpark of $250 to $300 for an ounce of medicine, but there might be slight variations in that. As a patient, once you've gotten your certification, if you're growing your own, you can possess up to 6 flowering plants, or you can have up to 2.5 ounces of prepared cannabis every 15 days. An ounce, you see the breakdown there, an ounce is about a sandwich baggie full. The picture on the left is of 1 gram. You can see our inventory tracking number there in the lighter for size comparison. Our patients in the last 5 years, there has been one number that has held steady, and that is that we find that our members average about an ounce a month. Folks are using about 1 gram a day. If you're cooking, if you're making an oil, that might go up. But for folks who are smoking the flower plant, 1 gram a day seems to be about it. So I've gotten my caregiver, or I'm coming to a dispensary. What are my options? There are 3 main options for consumption for a patient. The first is inhalation. And you see the gentleman there, he's using a portable vaporizer. So we can talk about smoking a pipe or a joint, and I know many folks are used to that, they're comfortable with it, it's, why should I switch? I will say that they have done the research on this, and when you are smoking a joint or a pipe, up to 88% of what you are inhaling is non-cannabinoids. It's not the active compounds. 88% is other things, products of combustion, gases, etc. When you switch to vaporizing with a fairly good vaporizer, those numbers flip right around, and what you are inhaling can be up to 95% cannabinoids, and only 5% or so other gases. So when you're thinking about inhalation, do think about vaporizing. There are some fairly reasonable models price-wise out there now, and more folks are looking at it. It's also discreet because when you're smoking a joint, you have side stream smoke or a pipe. There's that secondhand odor that's associated with it. You don't get that with a good vaporizer. Okay, so it's something to consider. Either vaporizing or combustion or smoking will have the same, onset and duration. The onset, you should feel what the product is going to do for you within about 10 minutes. If you take 1 sip off your vaporizer and set it aside and say, I'm going to pay attention to what this strain does for me, 0 to 10 minutes, you'll feel it. The duration can be highly variable depending on how familiar you are with cannabis and some other factors, what you've eaten, things like that. Typically, a single inhalation will last about 1 to 2 hours, maybe up to 4 for some folks, right? This means that it's very easy to self-titrate. When you get a new strain and you're not sure how it's going to affect you, you take one sip off that vaporizer or 1 puff off your cannabis cigarette and you set it down. And within about 15 minutes, you're going to know how that makes you feel and whether it's the right dosing, whether you need more or not. It also provides immediate relief, right? When you have acute pain, you wake up in the middle of the night and your sciatica is just pounding, or you feel that migraine coming on. It can be very, very quick. It's much faster even than taking an aspirin, okay? And you see the concerns there. There is some odor. And for some folks who have chronic pain, that short duration can itself be a negative. Like they need something that lasts longer. And that's where we want to look at edibles. So this next picture is of, I believe those are some tea preparations, like tea bags. But you can make anything with an oil or a butter can be infused with cannabis. All right. So the variety of forms is immense. However, with an edible, you're not going to feel the effects so immediately. For some folks, it can take up to 2 hours, right? And this is where folks get into trouble sometimes. There's, the problem or a problem that we hear is that somebody, gets home, and we always recommend starting low, starting slow. If the recommended dose is a whole cookie and you're new to that cookie, start with a quarter of it or half of it, and then wait a long time, right? Wait 2 hours, 3 hours to see how you feel. And when people don't do that is when they have trouble. Again, we talked about the fact that there is no fatal overdose possibility from cannabis alone, but you can overdose. You can take too much, and typically that will happen with an edible, where somebody takes half the cookie and waits 45 minutes and says, oh, I don't feel anything yet. I'm going to take the other half of that cookie. And then, 45 minutes after that, they have a very, very, in some cases, problematic feeling. It can cause feelings of anxiety, paranoia, things like that. The good news is that those feelings and that effect will not last. You kind of have to just wait it out. You can drink water or eat or listen to some relaxing music and it'll go away. But it can be unpleasant. Good news about the edibles is that their duration is much longer, right? Hours of relief. So if you need to sleep through the night, you may want to try some tincture or a caramel before you go to bed to help you sleep all the way through the night. Again, it's very discreet. There's a variety of forms and flavors. And just be aware and work with your provider on dosing and figuring out how much is enough, right? And then finally, there are topicals, balms, and salves. The onset for these can vary, but typically within an hour, you'll start feeling it. There's no psychoactive effect from a topical. It does not get into the bloodstream, and so we don't get high from them. But they can be very effective, like using a tiger balm or a Bengay type of application. Good for chronic, say, neuropathic pain, good for arthritic pain. Any place you would use, say, Bengay or Icy Hot, you can do a topical. There are concerns. Some people have said, well, it must be a placebo effect if it's causing pain relief without getting into the bloodstream. But what is likely happening is that the active compounds are penetrating and their antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties are coming into play in that very localized area without getting into the full bloodstream. So those are the three main categories and things to consider, pros and cons for each. It is very, very easy to make your own edibles and topicals at home. We have a variety of cookbooks, and the dispensary staff can work with you on that. But if you love working in the kitchen, you're a great baker or chef, it can be really enjoyable and very empowering too to make your own medicine. Not very difficult, and can be very creative. You can be just about as creative as you want to be. All right, so these side effects, these are commonly reported with folks who are either cannabis naive, who haven't used it a long time or never, or with people who have taken too much. Okay? So this is not not everyone is going to feel these things, but these are some things that you might run into. And as we go through them, think also of the last time you saw a pharmaceutical commercial on TV. When they have, in the background, they're showing the man and the woman romping in the field, but in the background, the voiceover is running through this list of potential side effects that goes on and on and on. Comparatively, this is a fairly safe option. And I guess there's one that I left off here. Probably the first one is euphoria, right? Euphoria, that psychoactive high, that sort of pleasant feeling that everything's going to be okay. Some people don't like that. If you have to get work done or you're going to be out in public, that's not comfortable for some folks. However, again, for our patients who are depressed, who are dealing with significant serious diagnoses and having a rough time, a little mild euphoria is maybe not a bad thing, right? Heart palpitations and low blood pressure are some two fairly common side effects They typically will resolve within the first, 5 to 10 minutes after that initial onset happens. The blood pressure may go up and then go down, kind of even out. But if you are on blood pressure medications, it's important to let your primary physician know that you're also using medical cannabis, just to let them, keep them in the loop. Anxiety, panic, paranoia, and hallucinations tend to be associated with an overdose, with too much of an edible, or with strains that are very high in THC. If you are already prone to anxiety, a high THC strain might not be a comfortable fit for you. You might want to look at strains that have a little bit lower THC, more CBD. Alternatively, look on the indica side of the indica sativa scale, because those tend not to produce those effects. Motor coordination problems, not certainly to the level that alcohol can do, but a little bit of coordination, a little bit of slowed reflexes, can be an issue. Short-term memory loss certainly is, again, it's not permanent. Your short-term memory starts functioning just fine again once the effects are done. And research is indicating that memory loss is more common in newer users and folks who use it very, very occasionally. But that somebody who is using this therapeutically, on a daily or weekly basis, that side effect is not going to persist as you grow accustomed to using cannabis. And then red eyes, doesn't happen to everyone, but it can, and dry mouth, which I never thought of as anything but a negative side effect until I talked to one of our members who has Lou Gehrig's disease, and he has been having a real hard time controlling his saliva. And so one of the benefits that he finds from smoking and eating is that he doesn't have to carry a washcloth around and wipe his mouth all the time. So a side effect that can be a positive one. And just a reminder, too much is not going to kill you. Time, water, food, and a relaxing environment all help. We get a lot of questions about is there anyone who definitely should not use cannabis? And I think the first thing to say is we need more research. We need to take the handcuffs off of our researchers and let them look into both the positives and the negatives and look at this from a whole plant perspective instead of continuing to pull these individual compounds apart. So that hampers our understanding of who really shouldn't use this. But we know for sure that when you mix cannabis and alcohol, it amplifies the effects of both. Your motor control and decision-making centers in your brain go haywire all the faster. So we never recommend combining the two. And then adolescence. No one thinks, again, that adolescents, barring serious illness, should use this stuff. All right, their brains are still developing, and cannabis does, especially in heavy, for a heavy user, it starts to rewire and change the way our synapses fire, our transmitters connect and talk to each other. So those two groups, we would say, yeah, let's not mix cannabis with those two things. Now, if you have a personal or family history of mental disorder, the research is all over the board. There's research that says it's a high risk and it can trigger psychosis. And then there's research that says, well, we looked at it, and when we pulled all of the varying factors apart, including social class and economic status and all these other things, alcohol consumption, we couldn't say for sure that cannabis causes or triggers any of these things. It is definitely something to be aware of. Right? If you have or a family member has bipolar disorder, maybe this isn't a medicine for them. But it does not, the most recent research indicates that it does not potentiate or cause any of these diseases. And then there are possible negative interactions with barbiturates, antidepressants, and SSRIs, which are used, again, for depression, and it moderates our serotonin uptake. I think common sense has to come into play in the absence of a lot of research on this area. Millions, literally millions of people in the U.S. are using cannabis therapeutically or for social purposes. Many of those millions of folks are also using these other substances And we don't have reliable reports of huge populations of people falling out or becoming seriously ill from using these together. Now, that doesn't mean that those interactions aren't possible. Again, we would always say, be honest with your primary care physician and any other specialist if you're using this stuff, all right? One thing that we do find is, especially with the antidepressants and the SSRIs, is that members who start using for another condition often report to us that they are able to step down their antidepressants or step down the SSRIs. Especially, well, opioids, those are a different class of drugs, but the same thing, that cannabis sort of takes the place of some of these other pharmaceutical prescription drugs. Just remember, different strains, different delivery method, your own endocannabinoid system and metabolism, and then the unique set and setting, which is the mindset you bring and the setting in which you use your therapeutic cannabis. Those all combine, and they're all going to affect how the medicine affects you. What that means is that it's super empowering for the patient. You will develop a very personal relationship. You'll find that strain and that delivery method that works, and man, it is. It's like finding the I won't say the silver bullet because it won't cure or solve everything, but when you find the right dose and delivery method, it can bring great relief to patients. Always start slow, start small, especially with edibles. And finally, I want to conclude with a few sort of legal and rights-based topics. You have your certificate, right? It says you are a medical marijuana patient in the state of Maine. You can possess 2.5 ounces. You can use it. You can cook with it. You can transport it. Pretty much the only thing you can't do is sell it. You can share it with another patient. But what does it mean for housing, childcare, driving? What if you get VA benefits? What if you own guns? What if you are or want to be employed? I think these are each questions that we hear, not infrequently. I think the broad overview, both here in Maine and in the nation, as cases play out around these issues, so far, most of the time, courts, whether they're lower courts or district courts or higher appeals courts, side against the patient. All right. So let's look at housing here in Maine. If you are in federally funded housing, if you get housing assistance and you are a patient, unfortunately, our state has said that you can lose the housing benefits if you not just use in the apartment, not if you vaporize in the apartment, but if you store your medicines in your apartment. And again, it's unfortunate, but the state has said nope, and actually they have said that if somebody is applying for Section 8 housing and discloses that they are a medical marijuana patient, they can be discriminated against. They can be denied housing for disclosing. And this puts patients in a very bad position, right? You have to choose between housing your family and yourself, or perhaps lying, or figuring out some option to store and use your medicine off-site. So think about that. Child care, in general, there was a recent case here in Maine, and then there's a case in Kansas that I wanted to talk to you about. But here in Maine, a recent case, disputes over kids can get nasty, right? And so we had a father who was a patient and a mother who was not, and she noticed that the children would come back from visits to dad's smelling like cannabis. And she believed that dad was not engaging in kid-friendly activities while he had the kids, that he was not devoting his full attention to making sure that they were safe. And so she sued for full custody of the children, and the judge ruled in her favor, and he said, the fact that he is a medical marijuana patient is not the reason we're going to award her sole custody. So there's that. That fact alone is not enough for me to take, custody from him and give it to the mom. But what was his other behavior. his irresponsible actions, including how he was storing his medicine, who he was allowing in the house, and to use the medicine in front of the kids. And he said that is the reason that we're going to remove the child or the children from his protection. The woman that you see there holding up the FISO jail thing, that is Shona Banda, S-H-O-N-A, and her last name is Banda, B-A-N-D-A. Shona lives in Kansas, and Kansas is an illegal state, right? So she has been illegally medicating her Crohn's disease with cannabis, and she's been an activist, something of an activist in Kansas. Her child went to school, and during a DARE presentation, raised his hand and said, my mom doesn't call it marijuana, she calls it cannabis, and she uses it for medicine. And the school reported that to Child Protective Services, and Ms. Banda has had her children taken away from her at this time, and they are piling charges on her. She's facing like 30 years. Now again, Kansas doesn't have a medical program. She was doing what she needed to do illegally, but there's just not a lot of protection for parents, even good parents, even parents who are teaching their kids the right words to use for this medicine. The courts have not caught up with the people on this. So if you have children, of course we encourage you to store your medicine safely in the home and to talk in an age-appropriate way with your kids. Not only about your medicine, but about who else they should share that with, right? And that should probably be nobody, unfortunately. Until we get a little bit more sensible laws and rulings coming down, it is a risk. And we also know that disgruntled exes, whether there are children involved or not, have used the knowledge that their former partner is growing, let's say, to call in a report, a complaint, and have them investigated, right? So it's maybe it doesn't come to anything, but at least they're going to use that to hassle the person. So this is very important to be extremely responsible and cautious if you have kids about your use of this medicine. Driving, as long as you're not driving under the influence, you know, having it in your car, storing it in your car, transportation is not a bad, is not a negative. We would always recommend that you put it as far away from the driver's seat as possible. Store it in your trunk or the glove box. Use odor-proof containers. And of course, we would never recommend driving under the influence. Now, there is no existing OUI test for cannabis. The state of Maine tried to put a bill in place this year that would have created an arbitrary blood level that would be defined as impaired. But it's not like alcohol. It's not like a breathalyzer. You can have THC in your system for up to 30 days after you use it. You might not be under the influence at all. And so we keep educating and we keep fighting back against this idea that there should be some standard other than a roadside sobriety test to determine cannabis impairment. If you are a veteran, there's some good news. Up until 2011, the Veterans Administration, if you tested positive for marijuana, even if you were a patient in a legal medical state, you would lose all of your veterans benefits. No questions asked, all benefits removed. And of course, it had a very chilling effect on veterans, many of whom can benefit from this therapy. In 2011, they changed their policy and they issued a memo that said, all right, Veterans Administration doctors are not going to write certifications, but a veteran who uses medical marijuana in a state where it is legal is not going to lose their benefits. All right, so the VA docs are not going to, they're not going to certify you. You'll have to find a different certifying physician, but you will not lose your benefits that you have earned. One thing that they may do is if you are on an opiate program, if you're on a pain program, they will likely make you choose between medical marijuana or the opioids. And at this time, they do not allow any period of time to step down. They're not going to give you 6 months to, you know, reduce your dose of dose of opioids before you start the medicinal marijuana. So know that, but you will not lose your veterans benefits. Gun ownership, and Bill, I see you there, and let me just finish these last two, and we'll throw all the questions out together, okay? Thank you so much for your patience. Gun ownership. So do your gun owners' rights trump your medical marijuana rights or vice versa? Basically, this has still not played out fully in the courts. Maine's law is written in such a way that it pretty clearly states that being a medical marijuana patient does not infringe any of your other rights in the state. So if you are a gun owner, we would simply recommend never traveling with the two together. So if the gun is in the glove box, the cannabis is in the trunk. At home, if the gun safe is in the basement, the cannabis is stored in a lockbox upstairs. All right? Gun ownership really comes into play if you have a federal investigation going on, which again, most patients will not. The federal government will add years on to the penalties for possession. Let's say you've got 100 plants. That's X number of years. I want to say that's a 10-year sentence federally. If you have a gun in the same location, they can charge you. They can threaten you with up to 20 years. They can double the mandatory minimums. But that is only at the federal level. Maine is a pretty sensible state about gun rights, and we just recommend that our members also be sensible and responsible, and just keep these two things apart. Whether you're storing, transporting, or certainly using, not a good idea to clean your guns after you've medicated, things like that. And then existing or potential employment. Not so great news here so far, and these cases have been taken up to district courts all around the country, and they keep coming back in favor of the employer. The gentleman in the wheelchair there is Brandon Coates, and he was fired by Dish Network after revealing to them in his interview that he was a medical marijuana patient. They said, oh, it's not going to be a problem, it's Colorado. He went through, he did the pre-employment drug test, he started his work, and when the drug test came back, they said, oh, sorry, you cannot work here. And he took that all the way up, he appealed and everything, and they keep standing behind the employer on this one. I think this is going to change slowly over time. It is not difficult for an employer to do what WCM does. Certainly we employ patients, and all we ask is that if you are going to test positive, you be honest during the interview, show us your medical certificate, and then when your test comes back positive for THC, we have a little form that we fill out with the drug testing company that says, yes, you notified me, yes, we know that this person is a patient, and you know what, we're going to hire them anyway. So any employer can do that. And again, I think it's just going to be a matter of time as more people become educated about this plant and the people who use it, and those things will change. However, if you're planning to apply for a job and they do drug testing, or you think they might, you'll want to make that decision. Do I stop using my medicine for a month or 6 weeks? Do I stop using it entirely, right? Because there are companies that do pre-employment testing, and then some, I want to say there's about 500 companies, not too many in Maine, that do random drug testing checks. They are typically employers where they've got people driving a lot or operating heavy equipment, so it makes sense for them to do that. And we are working with a small group with the Department of Labor to try and increase understanding among employers that simply being a medical patient is not and should not be considered a negative in terms of hiring a good employee. So that's an overview of some of those topics, and we are coming to the end of my part of the presentation. We've got plenty of time to answer questions, but before we do, in addition to the PubMed site, again, www.pubmed.gov, you can search around there. These are two resources for you. NORML is a legalization group. They are, unabashedly pro-legalization. Pardon me. They also happen to operate a simply fantastic medical library on their site. And they put out a yearly overview of recent research. And so they are a fantastic resource for you as a new or a person who's considering becoming a patient. On the right, Americans for Safe Access puts out these condition-specific booklets that are absolutely free online. There's GI disorders, there's cancer, there's MS, all sorts of different conditions, and they are well researched and done in a way that you know, if you're trying to discuss this with a physician who might be hesitant, you know, you can download these and print them out for them, and it might help. They might still say no, but the more we get this information out there, the more people hear from average, everyday citizens who are saying, I'm finding relief from this, or I want to try this. I think it might be better for me than the prescription whatever that we're contemplating. The more the tide is going to turn. So I, again, want to thank everyone for being here today. We've got plenty of time for questions, and I'm seeing at least one in the chat room right now. So, Bill Goody Coots, if you would like to pose away, and everyone else too, we'll go ahead and see what we got. Ben, can you hear them if they talk?
Yes, I can.
Okay. You can see it. Oh, is that a private?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oops.
Cool. You can also, actually, you want to put your headphones back on?
Yeah.
Let them know that they can just say their questions while I find my...
Hello all. So if you do have a microphone, you can turn it on and pose a question that way if you like. That would be easier. Or if you're on a telephone. And then, of course, if you'd like to send us a question at patients@mainewellness.org, you can certainly do so. If something pops in your head later on today or next week, certainly you can do so.
All right, I have a good question coming through from Bill, and I don't know that everyone can see it, but it is regarding agitation of Alzheimer's, which is one of the qualifying conditions here in Maine. He says, might that definition include, quote, mild cognitive impairment where the patient is taking an Alzheimer's medication? Unfortunately, it does not. Agitation is a very specific piece of the Alzheimer's diagnosis, and it typically is a mid to late onset symptom. And so what you might find is that your family member or yourself, you may fit into one of the symptom categories, maybe for pain, if there's any cramping or any sort of physical deficits associated with the progression of your disease. But the mild cognitive impairment, although the science shows us that, you know, this has great promise for preventing that decline, in Maine, that is not technically a viable diagnosis yet. But it's good to know about this ahead of time and have the family be ready for when agitation does become a symptom, and know that this is an option for them.
Yeah, this is Pam. I just want to say thank you.
You're welcome, Pam. Thank you.
All right, and we have another question. My doctor is part of Maine Med, so he says he doesn't certify. What would you recommend for my next step? Wow, and we hear this all the time, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the doctor doesn't think this is going to be a good medicine or a good therapy. Many of these large practices discourage, if they don't outright forbid doctors, they discourage them from certifying patients, and their fear is that they are going to lose federal funding. They're going to get in trouble with Medicaid, Medicare, and they're going to lose dollars. And you know, you can tell them until you're blue in the face that this has never happened, and that the optics would be so miserable if that did happen. You know, for the government to take this away from a hospital. But that's not, you know, neither here nor there. So if your physician doesn't, you know, won't or can't certify, there are medical marijuana specialists in Maine. Now, because of our regulations, we keep a pretty bright line. WCM doesn't recommend one of these specialists over another. There are, especially if you're in the southern part of the state, you're going to have a few more options, I think. But if you Google Maine medical marijuana doctor and look for the doctor's offices that pop up, some of those results are going to come back to clearinghouses that haven't always approved, you know, with the doctor that they're okay to put on the list. But if you see a physician's private practice come up in response to that Google search for Maine medical marijuana doctor, you know, from everything I've seen as recently as yesterday, the top individual physician results on the first 2 pages, at least, on a Google search, are all reputable to the best of our knowledge. And then we would suggest that you call the doctor's office and ask a few questions. First of all, because this visit won't be covered by insurance, you're going to want to ask if they have any sort of a sliding scale that might help you with payments. And the payments, you know, they range. I've seen everything from $150 to $300 for a visit, right? So you're going to want to check out what the cost is. Is there a sliding scale? And then next, what do you get from that? You're going to want to look for a physician who is going to want to see your medical records. You'll want to practice where, you know, somebody actually comes and gives you a little physical and talks with you a little bit, gets to know you a little bit, and what you're looking for. And then a good physician, a good specialist, is probably going to have some suggestions for you in terms of what type of strain or delivery method they might suggest that you start with. Okay, so I think if your physician, if your primary doesn't certify, your first step is to start Googling and spend some time doing some phone calls with the specialist physicians who are in your neck of the woods. Are there any other questions? Ben, are you hearing any? No? Everybody's good? All right. Well, I see. Yeah. No. Thank you guys so much. You know, if anybody has any further questions, as Ben said, you can shoot them to patients, PATIENTS, @mainewellness.org, and we'd be happy to help you. And thank you again for spending some time with us on this beautiful day. Go out and enjoy it, and be well. And we wish you a good rest of your week. Thank you so much.